Imagine you have these two massive, sprawling empires, right? The Romans and the Persians.
Oh, the undisputed superpowers of their era.
Exactly. I mean, we are talking about centuries of entrenched wealth, massive infrastructure, highly organized standing armies.
And advanced military technology for the time.
Right, all of it. And then, historically speaking, in just this remarkably short span of time, they are completely shattered.
Just entirely dismantled.
And they're shattered by this group emerging from the Arabian Peninsula, right? A group that was vastly outnumbered, lacking any centralized artillery, and, carrying a fraction of the material resources.
Which, on paper, makes absolutely zero sense.
None. The empire should have crushed that kind of opposition in a matter of weeks, maybe days.
Yeah.
Yet they collapsed.
They completely folded.
So when sociologists and historians analyze that anomaly today, they point to this rather disturbing conclusion, which is that the empires died because they were operating on what we call worn-out ideas.
Yeah, and it is one of the most stark examples of how material power, like physical resources, just cannot sustain a society once its internal ideological engine has died.
It's like the engine seizes up, right?
Precisely. I mean, the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, they had the armor, they had the complex taxation systems, the monumental architecture, but underneath all that, their socioeconomic structures had just calcified into these oppressive hierarchies.
The blood wasn't flowing anymore.
Right. The original ideas that had built those civilizations were just exhausted. They had zero kinetic energy left.
And that concept, the survival and death of civilizations based purely on their ideological engines, that is exactly what we are dissecting in our deep dive today.
It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. So for you listening, we are going to be looking at a very specific, deeply analytical sociological framework today. It's derived from a lecture by Tolu-e-Islam, specifically lecture 1417.
Which unpacks a foundational text, Surah Al-Ankabut, Ayat 46 to 51.
Yes, and we should establish right up front here, we are not approaching this as a theological sermon.
Not at all. We are looking at this strictly through the lens of systems engineering and sociology.
No preaching, no sentimentality.
Exactly. The text operates as a structural blueprint. I mean, it lays out the exact mechanics of how a society thrives, how it interacts with competing systems, and ultimately why it fails.
It's a purely rational socioeconomic analysis of cause and effect.
Absolutely.
So the core question this text tries to answer is how different communities and ideologies should clash.
Because they inevitably will clash.
Right, because normally, when we think about cross-community engagement, whether that's political factions, economic systems, national identities, we assume it's this winner-take-all battlefield.
Yeah, I have my worldview, you have yours, and the goal is just conquest.
Right. We assume it requires brute force. Whether that's military, rhetorical, institutional, you just have to defeat the other side.
The standard assumption is that survival requires a zero-sum victory, You secure your ideology by humiliating or destroying the competing one.
But what is so striking about this particular text is that it completely dismantles that by confrontation methodology.
It totally explodes it.
It argues that if you approach civilizational interaction as a gladiatorial arena, you are actually already demonstrating that your own system is structurally weak.
Yeah, if you have to force it, your code is broken.
Exactly. So let's look at the specific protocol the text provides for this. It gives this direct instruction in Ayat 29.46 on how to engage with what it calls the people of the book.
Which essentially refers to other established, codified ideological or religious communities, right?
Right. And the translation roughly says, do not argue with the people of the book, except in the best way. The Arabic is al-atihiyasan.
Al-atihiyasan, yes.
It says, except those of them who do wrong. And say, we believe in what was revealed to us and revealed to you, our God and your God is one, and to him we submit.
Now, that phrase, al-atihiyasan, which translates to in the best way, it's so frequently misinterpreted as just a polite suggestion.
Like use your inside voice.
Exactly. Yeah. People read it and think it just means, keep your voice down, be respectful, use good manners. But from a systems perspective, etiquette is irrelevant here.
So what is it then?
This is a rigid, operational standard for intellectual engagement. The text is demanding that debate be reframed entirely as a joint problem-solving exercise.
Okay, wait, I'm stuck here. You're saying the goal is joint problem-solving.
Yes.
But, I mean, if you put two people with fundamentally opposing worldviews in a room let's say an ardent free market capitalist and a command economy communist, they don't even agree on what the problem is,
That's very true.
let alone the solution. I mean, one thinks the problem is state interference, right? The other thinks the problem is private capital.
Yeah.
So how does this protocol actually survive contact with reality when the two sides are diametrically opposed?
Well, that is the exact friction the text anticipates, and it provides a structural solution in the very next clause. Say, we believe in what was revealed to us and revealed to you, our God and your God is one.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Look at the sociological function of that statement. It is a direct instruction to locate the ultimate shared baseline.
The common axiom.
Exactly, the common axiom. You are required to establish that common ground before you contest a single point of difference.
So, in a secular systemic sense,
Yeah.
saying our God and your God is one means acknowledging a singular governing reality.
Yes.
Like a universal law that applies to both of us,
Yeah.
regardless of our ideological differences.
Precisely. It is the recognition of a shared objective reality. If we use your capitalist and communist example, if they start by arguing over the mechanisms of production, they will just yell at each other indefinitely.
They'll never get anywhere.
Right. So the protocol demands they step back and find the baseline axiom. Can they both agree that the ultimate goal of an economic system should be the equitable flourishing of human life?
Okay, yeah.
And that human beings require certain material conditions to survive?
Right, if they can't agree on that, there isn't even a foundation for an argument, there's no point.
Exactly. But if they can agree on that shared metric, the entire nature of the interaction changes. They are no longer fighting for intellectual dominance.
They are sitting on the same side of the table now.
Yes, looking at the problem of human flourishing together and testing their respective ideological tools to see which one actually solves the problem under the governing laws of sociology and economics.
Wow, that shifts the dynamic entirely. You are building a bridge from the bedrock rather than standing on opposite cliffs shouting over the chasm.
It's a total paradigm shift.
And the text is making this an absolute prerequisite for engagement.
It is a prerequisite because without a shared axiom, any debate is just performance art. It's ego-driven.
It's just noise.
Yeah, just noise.
Yeah.
The text is primarily concerned with establishing a functioning socio-economic order, and you cannot build order through pure confrontation. You have to anchor the discussion in a shared reality.
Which brings us to the methodology itself. Because the text doesn't just stop at finding common ground, does it?
No, it regulates the exact nature of the argument.
Right. The source material spends a lot of time on the linguistic roots of the Arabic phrase used here.
Yeah.
Jadala bilati hiya asan.
Yes, jadala meaning to dispute or argue.
So what's the linguistic significance there?
The linguistic analysis here is critical. The text is applying a strict quality control standard to the method of argument itself. Think of it like an ISO certification for intellectual debate.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, because asan means the most excellent, the absolute best standard. If an argument utilizes logical fallacies.
Or if it relies on emotional coercion.
Exactly. If it uses straw man tactics or ad hominem attacks, it fails the standard. It is structurally defective.
So it's not just about having the right answer. It's about proving it through a flawless process.
Yes.
But why is the text so obsessed with the methodology? I mean, if my ideology is genuinely superior, shouldn't it matter more what I'm arguing rather than how I argue it?
Because in this framework, the methodology reveals the integrity of the ideology itself. If you have to resort to emotional manipulation or coercion to convince someone of your system, it is a glaring indicator that your system has internal structural weaknesses.
It's overcompensating.
Right. A truly robust, functioning system doesn't need you to cheat on its behalf. The math should speak for itself.
That is profound, and that leads directly to what the source highlights in Ayat 29.51.
The evidentiary clause.
Yes, the opponents are demanding some kind of validation, and the text's response is it not enough for them that we sent down to you the book that is recited to them?
That verse is a profound sociological declaration. Is the book not enough?
Right.
The book in this context represents a coherent, examinable, rationally structured code of life. It is a comprehensive body of argument. The text is asserting its own absolute sufficiency.
It's essentially saying, look, here's the complete blueprint. Here's the socioeconomic code. Examine it.
Yes.
It requires no external validation.
It requires no spectacle. It requires no theatrical performance.
Right.
If we look at this through the lens of the sciences, a solid theory like thermodynamics doesn't require a scientist to perform a magic trick to prove it works.
You don't need fireworks for gravity.
Exactly. You test the variables, you run the equations, and you observe the results. If a physicist had to rely on a light show to convince you of their findings, you would instantly suspect their data was fabricated.
You'd think it was a scam. But history shows us that human beings constantly demand the light show.
We love the spectacle.
We really do. If a self-sufficient, rational argument is the gold standard, why is it that societies are so deeply obsessed with the supernatural? Why do we constantly demand miracles instead of just reading the text?
Well, that tension is exactly what Ayat 29.50 addresses. The opponents of this new ideological framework are actively demanding signs from their Lord.
And signs here clearly means supernatural miracles.
Yes, they want the laws of physics to be suspended. They want a mountain to turn into gold or the moon to split.
And the source material dissects this demand mercilessly.
It really does.
It doesn't treat the demand for miracles as a genuine search for truth, does it?
Not at all. It frames it as a highly sophisticated form of cognitive evasion.
A cognitive evasion. Explain that.
It is the ultimate defense mechanism of a closed mind. Just look at the psychology of a miracle. By definition, a miracle is a momentary disruption of reality.
Right.
It forces a temporary state of psychological awe. But what does it actually teach you?
Nothing structural.
Exactly.
I mean, if I'm trying to figure out how to build a society where people don't starve and someone suddenly levitates a boulder, I might be terrified or amazed.
Sure, you'd be shocked.
But I still don't know how to structure an equitable agricultural system. It's like a flashbulb going off in a dark room. It blinds you for a second, but when the spot's clear from your eyes, you're still sitting in the dark.
That is precisely the argument the text makes. A miracle builds no structural understanding. Furthermore, the source points out a historical pattern. Miracles persuade almost nobody who has pre-decided to reject a system.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, if someone is heavily invested in an oppressive status quo and you show them a miracle, they will just call it sorcery or an illusion. They will find a way to dismiss it.
Because accepting it would mean they have to dismantle their own power structures.
Exactly. So demanding the miracle is just a stalling tactic.
It is a way of continuously moving the goalposts.
Yes. You present a perfectly rational, functioning socioeconomic blueprint, but it requires hard work to implement. It requires giving up certain privileges.
Nobody wants to do that.
Right. So instead of engaging with that difficult reality, the opponent says, I won't believe this blueprint is valid unless you make fire rain from the sky.
It sounds like they're setting a high standard for evidence, but in reality, they're just refusing to do the math.
They're avoiding the work entirely.
You know, this mechanism of cognitive evasion feels incredibly relevant right now.
Oh, absolutely.
We don't necessarily demand literal supernatural miracles today, but the structure of the evasion is exactly the same.
How?
Well, we live in an information ecosystem driven by 247 political theater, right? Algorithmic echo chambers, sensationalism. The modern equivalent of demanding a miracle is demanding an emotional hit.
Oh, we demand the viral takedown.
Yes.
We demand the snappy 10-second video clip that totally humiliates the opposing viewpoint.
Exactly. We want the emotional spectacle that bypasses our critical faculties entirely. I mean, if a politician or an economist publishes a dense 200-page policy paper detailing how to reform healthcare.
Almost nobody reads it.
Right. Nobody. But if they get on a stage and deliver a blistering, emotionally manipulative speech, people will base their entire worldview on it.
We are still demanding the fireworks.
We really are.
And what the source material is stating with absolute clarity is that the ultimate test of any ideology is whether it invites you to read its source code.
Is the book not enough?
Yes. A functioning system demands that you engage with the logic, test the principles, and observe the socioeconomic outcomes. Engaging the text is the true test of intellect. Demanding the spectacle is intellectual surrender.
So let's follow this trajectory to its natural conclusion.
Okay.
If a society abandons this engine of reason, if it stops relying on a self-sufficient argument and instead reverts to demanding spectacles, or if it just mechanically goes through the motions of an ideology without understanding it, what actually happens to that society?
The source material provides a brutal, unequivocal answer to that. And it ties directly back to our opening discussion about the Romans and the Persians.
Oh.
The lecture introduces a highly specific principle regarding historical causality. It says, the verdict of history is that worn-out ideas have never risen to power among a people who have worn them out.
That phrasing is chilling. Worn-out ideas.
Yeah.
Let's define what that actually means mechanically. How does an idea wear out?
An idea wears out when it loses its kinetic energy, when it is no longer capable of solving the problems of the society it governs.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about the ideological trajectory of a massive empire. In its early stages, it might have been driven by a vital, dynamic set of principles. It had momentum.
Right, it organized labor, dispensed some form of justice, expanded its borders.
Exactly, but over centuries, those principles calcify.
The structures become rigid. The bureaucracy exists only to serve itself.
Yes, the wealth concentrates at the very top, and the institutions that were originally meant to protect the population become tools of extraction.
The ideology basically becomes an empty shell.
Exactly. The society still uses the original vocabulary. They still build monuments to their founding principles. They perform the grand state rituals perfectly.
But the socioeconomic reality on the ground is stark inequity, corruption, and systemic failure.
Right. The ideas are worn out.
And the source notes that when a society reaches this stage of exhaustion, it cannot revive itself using the same ideas that it just exhausted.
You can't fix a broken engine by just polishing the exterior harder.
That makes sense. Which brings us back to the clash between the early Arabs and those massive empires.
Yes. The Arabs, at that specific historical moment, were operating on a newly implemented, coherent system of laws.
It was a vital, living ideological force.
It actively dismantled tribal hierarchies and instituted a profound sense of socioeconomic equity. It was a functioning system.
It was an open source code that was currently compiling without any errors, whereas the Roman and Persian codes were full of fatal bugs.
That's a perfect way to put it. And when a living system clashes with a dead system, the dead system shatters, regardless of how heavily armored it is.
Because the armor is just a shell protecting a corpse.
Exactly.
Speaking of corpses, the lecture provides an incredibly dark, visceral metaphor to explain this concept of a dead system, specifically addressing societies that try to force life back into empty rituals.
The metaphor of the corpse, yes.
It's so striking. Walk us through it.
It is a profound, if morbid, illustration. The source describes a scenario where a man goes to a graveyard, digs up a corpse, brings it into his house, props it up in a chair, and places a plate of food in front of it.
Okay.
Naturally, the corpse doesn't eat. It doesn't speak. And the man becomes furious. He starts violently threatening the corpse, demanding that it consume the food.
I mean, the absurdity of it is the point.
Completely.
You look at that and think, the man has lost his mind. You cannot force biological function into a system where the life force has already departed.
But the source uses this to perfectly mirror how societies treat formalistic religion or calcified ideologies.
It applies this directly to religious practices.
Yeah.
Right? Specifically, salat.
Yes, which is commonly translated as ritual prayer. But in the framework of this source, salat is not meant to be a magical chant or a passive meditation.
What is it meant to be?
It is explicitly described as a systemic mechanism designed to prevent wrongdoing, or fasha, and inequity, munkar.
So it's supposed to be an active societal training program.
Exactly.
It's a mechanism that yields a specific, observable result in the community.
Yes. If the mechanism is functioning, you should see a society with high integrity, justice, and social cohesion.
But the source points out that in many societies, fasha and munkar are running rampant.
There is massive corruption, extreme poverty, and exploitation all over the place.
Yet, the people are still obsessively performing the physical motions of salat.
They are performing the rituals perfectly, and they wonder why their society is still collapsing.
Because they have uncoupled the ritual from the systemic ideology it was meant to uphold.
Exactly.
It's like, do the physical motions of driving a car, turning an imaginary steering wheel, pressing an imaginary pedal while sitting on a park bench, and being furious that you aren't moving forward.
They are propping up a mummy. They are yelling at a corpse, demanding that it eat.
Wow.
The physical motions are there, but this systemic life has left the body. The source argues that when a society reaches this stage of empty formalism, when it mechanically repeats words without implementing the socioeconomic justice those words demand, it is historically doomed.
It just cannot generate the energy required to survive a clash with a living, rational idea.
No, it can't.
That raises a massive question about accountability, though.
How so?
Well, if historical success relies on maintaining a vital, rational ideology, and failures the result of retreating into cognitive evasion or empty formalism, how does this system actually sort the winners from the losers?
Oh, right.
Who is to blame when the empire falls?
This brings us to the core mechanism of causality in the text, which is the law of requital, or mukafat amal.
The text addresses this in Ayat 29.49, doesn't it?
It does. It states, only the wrongdoers reject our signs. The Arabic word used there is zalimun.
Now, normally when we hear wrongdoers in a scriptural context, we immediately think of theological sinners.
Right, people who broke a moral rule and are going to be punished in an afterlife.
Yeah, but the source strips all that theology away.
It redefines the concept entirely. In this framework, zulm, which is the root of zalimun, means placing something where it does not belong.
Interesting.
It means disrupting the balance of a functioning system. And the law of requital is not some divine lightning bolt, you know. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of that disruption.
It is the sociological equivalent of Newton's third law.
Yeah.
Every action has a reaction.
Exactly.
So how does rejecting the signs make someone a systemic disruptor?
Well, remember what we established earlier about the signs. They are not miracles.
Right. The sign is the book. It is the coherent, rationally sufficient argument.
Yes. The comprehensive blueprint for a functioning society.
Is the book not enough?
Exactly. So the text is laying out a sequence of events. First, the perfectly coherent, logically sufficient argument is fully delivered. It is explained. It is made accessible.
Okay.
At that point, rejecting the blueprint is no longer an innocent mistake. It is not an information gap. You cannot claim ignorance.
Because the evidence is clearly presented. I mean, the structural math of the society is laid out on the table for anyone to verify.
Therefore, if you reject it after it has been made clear, it is a deliberate, systemic choice. You are willfully refusing to align your society with reality.
Perhaps because it threatens your economic interests.
Or your political power. Or simply your ego.
Right.
That deliberate refusal to implement the necessary code is what makes you a zalim. You are actively choosing failure. And that choice triggers the historical consequences of civilizational collapse.
There is a key phrase in Ayat 29.49 that clarifies this even further. It says that these signs are clear in the breasts of those given knowledge.
Yes.
The term used is ilm. Now, in many traditions, given knowledge implies some kind of esoteric, mystical enlightenment that only a select few receive.
And the source categorically rejects that interpretation.
Really? How does it define ilm then?
Ilm in this context refers to objective observation and reason. It refers to people who actively use their intellect to process data. Think of an aerospace engineer looking at the schematics for a new aircraft. The engineer doesn't need a mystical vision to know if the plane will fly.
They just read the math.
Exactly. They possess the knowledge to recognize a sufficient structural argument when they see it.
So those who utilize objective observation look at the blueprint and say, yes, this socioeconomic model functions. It will prevent exploitation and ensure stability.
Yes. The text is stating that to a rational observer, the validity of the system is entirely self-evident.
Which means the burden of refusal falls completely and entirely on the one who refuses.
There is no shifting the blame. You cannot blame the universe, or historical circumstance, or bad luck.
You chose it.
The system provided the necessary input. It gave you the blueprint. Your rejection of that blueprint ensures a failed output.
History is absolutely unforgiving to societies that choose cognitive evasion over rational implementation.
The law of requital will dismantle them.
All right, let's pull all these sociological, historical, and linguistic threads together. We are looking at a grand synthesis here, really. A unified theory of civilizational mechanics.
It's a massive framework.
It is. And what stands out most to me is the stark contrast between what is constantly changing in human history and what remains absolute and permanent.
That distinction between permanence and change is the genius of the protocol outlined in the Surah. Because if you look at the surface of human history, it seems like total chaos.
The variables are in constant flux.
No way.
The specific empires rise and fall. Yesterday, it was the Byzantines and the Sassanids fighting the Arabs over imperial divinity and feudal taxation.
Right.
A century later, it's something else. Today, it's global superpowers fighting over supply chains, technological supremacy, and competing models of governance.
The digital landscape has created entirely new forms of tribalism, too.
Exactly. The specific content of the argument, the variables, are always changing.
But underneath that chaos, the structural formula remains entirely constant. The source text has revealed a three-step model for intellectual and civilizational engagement that transcends the specific variables of any era.
It is a permanent protocol.
Yes.
So let's lay out those 3 permanent steps for you listening. Step 1. You must engage other communities from shared axioms.
The absolute necessity of locating the common ground. Our God and your God is one.
Right, acknowledging a singular governing reality before contesting differences.
Which transforms the interaction from a war of annihilation into an exercise in joint problem solving.
Then step 2, you must argue in the absolute best, most intellectually rigorous manner.
Jadala bilati hiya hasan. The methodology of your engagement must be flawless. It must be free of logical fallacy, emotional manipulation, and coercion.
Because the structural integrity of your argument reflects the viability of your entire ideology.
Exactly.
And finally, step 3, you must trust the complete sufficiency of a coherent argument.
Rely purely on the internal logic and the observable socio-economic outcomes of your system. Is the book not enough?
You must never demand and never perform a supernatural spectacle or an emotional fireworks display to validate your truth.
It's an incredibly stringent standard.
It really is. This text models a protocol that strictly avoids the two great extremes of human ideological conflict.
Which are?
Well, on one hand, it never coerces. It doesn't rely on brute military or rhetorical force to smash the opponent.
Right.
But on the other hand, it never performs. It refuses to utilize the cheap theatricality of miracles or emotional manipulation. It just stands on the math.
It relies entirely on the strength of its internal logic.
And historically, as the lecture demonstrates, societies that manage to adopt this engine of reason are the ones that thrive and innovate.
Conversely, those that retreat into cognitive evasion, those that prop up the corpses of empty rituals and demand miracles so they don't have to read the text, are inevitably crushed by the law of requital.
They collapse under the weight of their own worn-out ideas.
They do.
This protocol is profoundly demanding. It doesn't allow for intellectual laziness. And while we've been talking about massive empires and civilizational collapse, the mechanisms apply at every single level of human organization.
All macro and micro.
Exactly. Whether you are analyzing a corporate strategy, evaluating a political platform, or just trying to navigate a highly polarized argument in your own community, the principles are identical.
Finding the shared axiom and demanding a self-sufficient, logical argument cuts through the noise of any debate.
It does. And we want to leave you with a final thought to consider as you navigate that noise. Take a hard, objective look at the core beliefs, the political affiliations, or the institutional ideologies you hold most strongly right now.
Evaluate them using this exact protocol.
Ask yourself, are the ideologies you align with functioning as an actual engine of reason? Can they withstand brutal, logical critique without requiring you to resort to emotional outrage, logical fallacies, or personal attacks to defend them?
Do they produce tangible, equitable results in reality?
Or are you perhaps just propping up a worn-out idea? Are you going through the motions of an empty ritual, secretly hoping for some external spectacle like a viral moment, a sudden shift in power, or a rhetorical miracle just so you don't have to do the hard work of examining the source code and admitting that the system might be broken?
The choice between engaging the text and screaming at a corpse is ultimately yours.
Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.